The meeting, and then I will start the first presentation of this webinar. And I realized that I actually haven't even properly introduced myself while starting this meeting. Of course, you've seen the invite, but my name is Elko Cox, and I'm assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where I'm leading a research group mainly on all sorts of aspects around critical infrastructure risk modeling, and I've been working on this topic for quite a few years now. So in my 10 minutes, I really want to take you to some of the problems and gaps I've identified, in particular of the past few years while working on this risk modeling field. And I think it was already nicely, maybe some of you have read this already, but if not, I think it's a very interesting piece of work written by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. They wrote these principles for resilient infrastructure. I think it's a very interesting piece of work. And already in the second paragraph of their introduction, they sort of, I think, nicely highlight and summarize a little bit of some of the things that we are capable to do so in some aspects, but still not really fully capable of, at least not in an operational way. And I think those are really taking fully into account the interdependent nature of infrastructure and services, and really being able to model these cascading impacts that a natural hazard or a disaster can have across different infrastructure systems and towards society. And those are also the few elements of these things that I will focus on in the remaining of my presentation. But of course, it's always really important to already highlight and emphasize a little bit on what we're good at. And of course, we're good at many things, but these are just the few things that I believe are for sure we're really good at, and at least quite a lot of work has been put into these things. So obviously, there's a lot of academic exercises have been there, a lot of theoretical modeling on critical infrastructure interdependency. If you would search around for articles on infrastructure risk modeling, infrastructure interdependencies, you'll find many, but quite a few of them tend to do have a theoretical or stylized focus. And they have really helped us a lot to better understand the different dynamics, how the different systems work. And we are really good at that, but it often has stopped with these theoretical modeling. And of course, there are papers who have moved beyond, but I think the bulk is that we've developed a lot of very sound and interesting theoretical models. I think we're really good at asset level risk assessments, both on a very large scale. So for instance, I also did some of these global and continental risk assessments on asset level, but we also know that there are a lot of, from an engineering community perspective, also a lot of very good work has been done on high resolution, super detailed risk assessments on asset level, in particular, of course, also for earthquakes and tropical cyclones. So I think we're pretty much there, at least method-wise, when it comes to modeling asset level assessments. Of course, we can debate on whether we get all our assumptions right, and particularly with these large-scale global assessments, but the methods, I think, are pretty sound and are there. And if you look at which hazards are we good at, I think much of the work has focused on floods, tropical cyclones, and earthquakes. Of course, some work also on landslides and heat stress, but I think the majority is on floods, TCs, and earthquakes. So what are then some of these important aspects that I believe we still need to work on? And each of these elements also has an individual slide to dig into a bit more into the details of it. So one thing that's also some of the aspects that Alexander will work on, so going beyond disciplines. So most of the work, and this is not a judgment, is grounded, I think, in engineering, but really truly assessing the costs and benefits of infrastructure assessments really need to go across different disciplines. Validation, I think validation is an obvious one, but as I also will show and talk about in a minute, it is still quite really essential to work on. And finally, also, again, linking this to the calls from all these multilateral organizations like the European Commission, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, knowing more about these compound and consecutive disasters, really taking this multi-hazard focus is also really important to work on. So starting off with this going beyond disciplines, as said, generally we are living in an engineering heavy research domain, again, not a judgment, But already taking this example, so here's the image here is the flooding of the Dawlish railway line in Cornwall in the UK, and already disentangling all the impacts of what such a disruption of such a line can have really calls upon actually a much more cross or interdisciplinary approach than just looking at the specific details of the impact on the railway line itself. We are interested in which type of people were being affected. Can we say something about the different vulnerabilities of these people? Which type of companies were affected? How many people were disrupted along the route? Is there an impact towards the regional economy? How important will this railway line be for the future of the economy for Cornwall? And particularly if we want to think about adaptation, is it cost benefit worthwhile to invest in this specific segment of the Dawlish railway line, or is it maybe as a society more interesting to reroute it to a different part of the region? So we really need to bring together quite a few of these different disciplines to answer the questions that are being asked by the ADB, by the European Commission, and by our national governments, and even sometimes by our infrastructure providers. And then I think comes really one of the most important gaps for really being able to advance our modeling, and that's really validation. And what I've seen so far is that really only a handful of studies have registered and assessed the actual impacts of an event. So last year, I've published this article together with some of my colleagues, where we really tried in as much detail as possible, collect all the different information from news articles on the flood event in the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium in 2021. And that it was quite a bit of work to really scrape every bit of information to get a bit of an idea how long did it take for each of the infrastructure system to recover, how much initial destruction has taken place in the different countries where the flood also affected the areas quite differently. But this is just really one study, and I was also looking for more studies like this when I was writing this piece, or while we were writing this piece. And I couldn't really find anything. And I think we're really lacking a database or even a light version of this to be able to better validate our models. And I think that's why maybe we can get a little bit stuck also within our stylized and theoretical models, because it's really hard indeed to make this step to do our results actually make sense. So I really also would call for collecting this information when an event happens within your country or region, and it's super valuable and worthwhile if we have more events, even knowing how many assets were affected, how many days without power, how many days were telecom shut down, how long did it take for telecom to be back on track again, how long did it take for water supply to be back on track. All these different numbers, even though they might sound like simple metrics, they're often not being registered. And also, if I would go back into the news of Germany and the Netherlands of 2021, I cannot find most of it anymore. Okay, it might be in behind some paywalls, but at least it's very valuable to collect this type of information to advance our modeling capabilities. Then the third element was this compound and consecutive disaster. And there, I think there's really some interesting work also to be done. So for compound events, so of course, what will happen when an extreme rainfall event triggers a landslide? And how do we incorporate this into our damage framework? How do we deal with, for instance, double counting? How do we tailor our vulnerability curves? Do we take a different approach? Or what if extreme rainfall occurs right after an earthquake or during a drought event, like we're seeing now in Spain or in Italy? How does the state of the infrastructure as a result of an earthquake or a drought affect its vulnerability when an extreme rainfall event occurs? And how does that hamper recovery? Like, I really think that this is really also some of the elements we really require some more modeling capabilities and some more focus on. At the moment, quite a few European projects are running also on this topic, and I'm sure across the world there are more projects working on this. But I think there are really quite a few gaps related, in particular, to this multi-hazard aspect of risk assessments. And finally, I think at the moment, not most importantly, because that is the largest gap, but at least in my area, I get most questions around this, both from governmental, but also from infrastructure providers, how to climate proof these assets. And in particular, like we often do have the technical solutions on how to make sure a specific asset can withstand more heat, or how a specific asset can deal with more water. But how do we actually properly assess the cost and the benefits of our investments? And in particularly, it's preferable to scale this up on a societal level. So of course, we can spend a lot of money on a particular asset to make sure it's climate proof. So make sure a substation in a specific village will never be flooded anymore. But is that on a societal level? Do we have the highest gains? Or maybe might not be the case, but maybe it's more cost efficient to give everyone a battery in their home to make sure they can deal with a power outage. I'm not saying that that would be a better approach, but there's really a desire to think a little bit more on different levels to do adaptation. So do we need to invest in assets? Do we need to make our network more redundant? Or do we actually need to adapt our society to make sure we can better withstand such disruptions? So we really need to think beyond our more classical thinking of strengthening specific assets to make sure we get a more climate resilient society, and particularly when it comes to vulnerability of our infrastructure systems. And then finally, as my last slide, and then Alexander will take over, we can of course think of much more work to be done. And I hope that quite a few already thought of vulnerability functions and fragility functions, which of course is already an ongoing issue of getting the right vulnerability functions, getting the right fragility functions for the right asset, for the right location. Of course, much work has to be done on that. Better cost estimates of reconstruction and recovery, better incorporation of equity within the risk frameworks is also something that only recently has been more explored. So there's really still many things we can think of, and I hope that I've been able to tease you a little bit already, and I'm very open for some of your ideas and thoughts on this. But now I give the floor to Alexander, and then there's plenty of room for discussion and debate on these elements. Thank you.
Thanks so much, dear Elko. And if there are any immediate questions, I'm sure we can handle them directly. So if you don't mind, Elko, are there any immediate questions to a really excellent introduction into main topical fields? Yeah, Katarina, please.
Hello, thank you, Alexander. So I would like to ask to Elko, what do you mean by incorporating equity, your last item in your last slide?
Yes, good point. So I wrote it a bit quickly indeed, just to briefly flag it. But what I think is quite important also when we think about investing in transportation infrastructure, that we do not always look at what brings the highest economic benefits, but that we really also more look from a welfare perspective. So what can bring the highest social welfare benefits?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also interesting, your question, Katarina, because actually we're trying to bridge over interdisciplinarily. So we also have another working member in the group. She's working heavily on justice, equity, and the social dimension of infrastructure service usage. And I think we'd also like to reach out to that community. But obviously, of course, we'll have to start somewhere. And so we're glad about any questions or interest into that you even find missing. Are there more questions maybe to Elko's presentation? Yeah, Heather.
Sure, yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit what you mean when you say stylized models, or how you're defining that.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so my definition for that is that I think there's quite a lot of literature on where we sort of simplify the real world, which makes sense, right? To sort of better understand these dynamics between how does interdependency work between electricity systems and telecommunication systems. We always, of course, simplify it and sort of make a more of an academic exercise, which is generally a simplified version of reality. And it makes sense, and we are very good at that. But I think to really move forward now, I think we should sort of challenge ourselves to try to mimic more the real complex world as well, despite all the difficulties it entails to do so.
Okay, so you mean, yeah, simplified models in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Heather. Fine by you? So, because we all live in a small world, as some of you might know from science, and this certainly is a topic for future research. Leonard.
Just one quick question from me. Thanks for the presentation. Is there a need to go beyond just natural hazards in a time when especially military conflict is coming back to the agenda? So to do something very similar to what the US economics did in the outbreak of, or even before the Second World War, for obviously first the ideas of protection of critical infrastructure against the effects of war, and afterwards then what used then was used then for the targeting of strategic bombing and nuclear warfare. Is there something that, well, maybe go back to that? Is that something where there can be interlinkages?
Sorry, to better understand your question, do you mean we should learn from those studies, or we should more incorporate non-natural hazards?
Yes, so the two provocations maybe is one, go beyond the natural hazards, right? To also look at other interrelations with non-natural hazard kind of types of scenarios. And the other thing is where is the connection to the military thinking? Because obviously they're looking into that, the old studies, the history-wise, they have been doing a lot of modeling as well. Is that something where that is ongoing at the moment? Where is it ongoing? And is there a need to go beyond this natural hazard at this moment?
Good question. Also, from a slightly difficult question to directly answer. Well, I think, of course, there could of course be a link made or towards non-natural hazards and war. And I also know that there are institutes, of course, working on this particular topic more on looking at the impacts of war on critical infrastructure. I'm sure there are. And also from a safety perspective, but I think also Alexander touches a little bit on safety. So maybe that also maybe answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, thanks very much. Leonard and we've been also in some discussions already. So I'd like to say that the topic of critical infrastructure has emerged actually from a terror background in the United States of America. And so it's quite interesting to analyze in which fields it has taken ground and where it's still lacking. And I think it's interesting that it took up in natural hazards research, but it took quite some time. So it's been developed around the area of, say, terror attacks or about technical failure. So we do have this man-made dimension in some fields, NATEC hazards, industrial accidents, etc. But we are lacking in other fields. And I think, Leonard, what you're alluding to is that there are certain fields who naturally are dealing with it. There's nothing to judge about. There's just something such as military research or even military, the Ukraine war is just one example. So to consider also the impacts on society, on food chains that are impacted, by a distant war. So definitely, I think we need to think together, but it's a sensitive topic. Even scientists consider themselves, safer to stay on one common ground. And what is that common ground? So is it ethical doing research that's connected to military is often a question as well. So I think it's an important question that you're raising. Thanks very much. And I think we need to digest this and consider also how we position ourselves to it, each of us. Yeah, as a moderator, I should take my job more serious. Mariana.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation, Erico, and a question for the both of you. I was thinking when listening to the presentation, what about social infrastructure? Because there's a lot on sewage systems or electricity systems, heating, so on and so forth. But when we had this flood in 2021 in Germany, we did interviews with people on how was the recovery, and it became very clear that social infrastructure, access to schools, access to like a mental health, access, even like swimming pools was something that that they could not do their activities and as they wish, like attending community centers and this kind of stuff. And they related this as really important for their recovery and for getting better again. So I was wondering, do you think it would be relevant to consider also this kind of infrastructure, or would be beyond?
No, absolutely. Well, actually, in fact, we're already including them. I consider them, I think most of our work and I think also within the European definition, social infrastructure, as you referred as hospitals and schools are, I think it has become common practice to also include them in your at least larger scale critical infrastructure risk assessments. I think it has become more and more common ground to consider them also as important critical infrastructure. So I fully agree, and I think it has been incorporated in most work nowadays.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's already incorporated in really many fields. It depends maybe how you see it, but definitely I think it should be included. And some people are thinking to rename it infrastructure service. So what is actually the service society sees as vital? In Germany, we have seen a discussion in the COVID-19 pandemic whether education is actually an infrastructure service that should be prioritized. But thanks, Mariana, for the, as usual, very good questions to the point. And I'm happy to see Herbert. I used a slide from you yesterday. I was surprised you're also taking photos of hamsters, the tiny furry animals. I could use them very well in my presentation about critical infrastructure. But now to your question.
Fine, thank you, Alex. I'm Herbert Sauruck from Austria. And I'm not on the research side so much, but more on the practical side as a blackout and crisis preparation expert. And in reflecting to Leonard, I would say it's not that important what is the source of the disruption. It's much more important how we can hold alive the supply. So from my point of view, it would be more important to focus to this how we can design systems and social behavior that whatever is the source for disruption, the supply of people is still possible. So not too much to prevent things. We do this already very much, but also how we can handle also uncertainty. And I fear we will face much more uncertainty in future, also from climate extremes, but also from other sides. And so it would be more important from my point of view and from the praxis side or the practical side to increase this resilience and robustness of structures. This is my point of view.
Thank you, Herbert. Elko, any thoughts on that, or should I reply?
No, go ahead. No, I think it's a good point that Herbert raised. I don't have much to add. I agree with the uncertainty towards the future, and that indeed the same approaches and methods can be used for different hazards and disasters, right? So there's for sure complementarity to exchanging ideas and work there.
Yeah, thanks. I can also just agree and say there has been a big call for a paradigm change in natural hazards research to focus more on the vulnerability side and not only on the hazard side. And the interesting thing is, Herbert, you know, in critical infrastructure, immediately almost it went to the impact side. So many researchers started not debating too much about threat assessment, but on the impact chains. But still, I think there's some research going and some awareness how to better connect both fields.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Roman.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks for hosting this discussion. It's super, super interesting. I just wanted to briefly ask as well, when it comes to critical infrastructure network modeling, data availability is usually the problem that we're facing. And one of the arguments facing when discussing with infrastructure operators is that they are fearing the potential misuse of this data for terror attacks, etc. And my question is there a possibility to weigh out the benefits of a higher data availability for natural hazard assessments with the downsides of military misuse for this information? Because it would really help to have an argument and an assessment of how these arguments weigh out with each other. So I think it's important to differentiate what are we using it for.
Yes, agree. I don't have the answer on how to convince them, but
That's a pity.
Yeah, in my experience, it's a problem when I'm a geographer. So when I'm accumulating data, it becomes sensitive at a point where it's not been accumulated in the open source data. So you can all draw together the different components yourself, and the adverse opponents could also do the same. But it's a bit our responsibility to think really what of the information could be misused. And this is a sensitive topic because of economic theft, you know, sabotage, and many other fields. So it's interesting, I think, what you raise, and I think especially how to weigh it. It's quite a tough question, you know, but it's stimulating certainly for further research. Thank you. Andreas.
Yeah, hi. I want to respond to Roman because I recently spoke to people from the whole world of encryption, the crypto world, and they say one of their base principles is to have everything open. Everything is available for testing, for making it stronger, because if it's weak in one way or the other, it does not sustain. There can be a threat. And I found it a really opening argument for the point we are trying to make for quite some time, to get critical infrastructure much more openly accessible for our modeling, to test it, to use it for this type of risk analysis, and not close it down and try to protect the data. It's out there. It's usually difficult to find, difficult to connect the data, but to connect the points, but could be an argument to be much more open about the data, because overall it would benefit us.
Right, I can just agree. And I think that's what drove me as a geographer also to have open data as much as we can. And it's interesting because the US government has openly published the possibilities of attack in 2010 when there was Stuxnet. So they made videos of it and distributed it. But of course, on the other hand, the data, they don't openly provide. So they have it in their Los Alamos and other facilities. So it's still a question, when do we risk to give it into the wrong hands? I don't think it's as easy as encoding, but it is actually an idea that is driving most of us researchers, open data, open publishing about it, but still there could be limits, you know? So I think it's good to analyze this further. Yeah, I like this discussion very much. Thank you very much for all the interest also in Elko's presentation. Just Elko reminded me that maybe we should consider going to the second presentation. But since we just thought that we need some stimulus for you guys, it already worked. So allow me to use 10 minutes of your time, or maybe a bit more, to share also some ideas from a geographer's point of view, and then collect your ideas. And I'll also be available another half an hour or hour afterwards. So if we have more time to discuss, I'll be around. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. It is actually the big blue planet, and it's not the big blue planet anymore. As you know it, it's actually the dark side when it's a nighttime vision. And still we see on the Arabian Peninsula and the River Nile, we see electric lights. So that's what's our infrastructure. And it depends very much on your view. What is your infrastructure even on that picture? And some people might consider that the oceans and actually the whole globe itself could be regarded an infrastructure, or the weather system, or the electricity, or the tiny, tiny people and animal you don't see at this resolution. So I tried to combine certain gaps that I know from my research. Apologies, it's a bit myopic because it's only what I've experienced. First of all, a knowledge and application gap. So I tried to show this at a few maps. So you see a city map of Cologne, the city center is here on the left, and there's a large flooded area in an extreme event. And what I found surprising was that fire brigades, but also hospital owners, were not aware that their properties are actually within a flood zone. So you experience that again and again, and especially with critical infrastructure, it often does not, it hasn't been mapped in that way, or they are still lacking these basic exposure assessments that 9 hospitals and 4 fire stations would be dysfunctional. And they couldn't operate then in a flood situation. Now, the next is that you have to ask, what does it mean, critical? And it's actually pointing towards a relevance. We are appointing a relevance to something and to be able to prioritize, but there's a gap. How do we do that? So I show you an example of a number of hospitals in Cologne City, and you can get different numbers, beds, station care, ambulance care. So, but which are the numbers to pick? There are 2 choices I want to show. One is critical means relevance in case of a failure. You go for the biggest. You know, if the biggest hospital fails, the largest supplier, then you would have 257,000 ambulance care not being treated. Or you go to the number of doctors, you know, so that's an easy way to say this is the biggest, it's also the highest priority. A second one, to look for the fewest, the opposite. There are very, very specialized hospitals, very few in Cologne, who are treating fire burns. Even from Aachen, after the terrorist attacks, they have been taken patients there by helicopter. So you can also argue the other way around. You could say the special care is my top 2. It's those 2 hospitals who can care for 10 adults or 2 children. They've ramped up the numbers, but you get the idea. Now you can even put that on a map and say, look, I combine this with an exposure assessment, and I have those critical because they are rare in the red donut shape, and critical because they're treating a high number of patients. And then you're finding out, okay, one is only in the flood zone, but the others out here could face heavy rain problems or others. But it does give you 2 ways to argue for decision makers. Here's highest exposure, here's the highest number, but there's also the rare function you'd like to preserve. Then we have shortages still in geoinformation. So I'm using geographic information systems, but some algorithms are missing in the applications. So for example, here you see some routing. If you want to save people, if you want to evacuate patients from hospital or just supply them with food or else, you would have here a driving route by the dotted lines from fire stations to the hospitals. But usually we either have the function that this boundary shape of flood is killing the road or not. That means it's blocked or it's open. But in fact, you could still navigate if your car is okay with it. And that means, okay, it means 10 centimeters or 40 or 50 centimeters with trucks. But this algorithms, how they are slowing down, so not to kill the motor running, is missing in our algorithms so far. And I think these type of assessments would be helpful. We've seen it in the 2021 flood in Germany, that this real-time navigation, but also planning was missing. There are gaps in analyzing cascading impacts, as Elko has shown, the cascading topic. And in reality, it looks like that. It's a hospital that got flooded in 2021. And you see here in the left is the entry. It was flooded up to the middle of the height here about water entering. You see it in the shades at the wall. So the hospital was dysfunctional, but also the access road in the middle photo was not usable because there are some trees being cut down. They were floating up in a flood. And we needed more information where to access the hospital and to evacuate the people. And it's not just a problem for cars, it's also a problem for electricity. Here you see a container with a thick cable that are the ones with a diesel generator to provide emergency power or water. And they also need to be able to navigate there to access it. So combining science with application, I think, is a challenge. And so we found out a number of schools, hospitals, supermarkets would be affected. And we made this publication in 2019 before the floods came. And already we were mapping on the right-hand side in red colors over 2,000 kilometers of roads that would be dysfunctional. But you see some that are yellow, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the important thing is to look on the left side, how to conceptualize that. So the flood is not only directly affecting the hospital, but also the infrastructure as roads and bridges, which is slowing down the emergency management. That's a cascading effect, maybe. And that is a gap also in the existing risk map. For example, you see the red and yellow roads on the top right map. And on the left map, you see a zoom in, and that's a highway, the Autobahn, A1, that's not flooded in the riverine exposure map. But in fact, it got flooded in the flash flood because water came a bit higher. And also it's unreliable to drive trucks over this in an emergency case when the ground of the traffic lane of the road is submerged. And in addition, we had another problem. It's the center here. It's a pit, a gravel pit that was filled with water, and it led to backward erosion, taking away some of the houses here. So this type of risk was not on the official map yet. We have to add secondary hazards as well on our existing risk maps. On the top right, you see yellow areas. This is additional areas of power supply failure. It's an assumption, it's in a scenario, but the provider said it's not totally wrong, at least. Gaps in the analysis of escalating risk could also include societal dimensions. Let me show you in this. Think that you have a background crisis on the big red arrow, for example, the Ukraine war, where we experience that gas supply could be or should be reduced. So we might face energy shortages. So what if a compounding escalation comes to it that people refuse to save energy because they think, it's an hoax, it's not real, or it shouldn't be my responsibility. Now think we have an additional event such a winter storm and a blackout event. What could be there as an additional last escalation event if frustration and societal dissatisfaction merges with a real situation? And I think this needs to be further analyzed to combine this better, both fields, the infrastructure technical side, the natural hazards, but also the societal impacts. Now, gaps between societal impacts and infrastructure interdependencies have been seen in events such as the Hurricane Katrina 2005, when thousands of people, mostly Black and from poorer segments of society, went into an evacuation area, a football stadium, the Superdome. These were the ones who couldn't afford a car or public transport. So people with another infrastructure service were better off. And I think this plays into the idea of equity and justice and needs to be further analyzed. There's a gap for the infrastructure for first responders, especially, and in the floods in 2021, we made a survey and we tried to ask them, so what was missing to help you in terms of technical infrastructure? You see wastewater, water, communication links, digital radio, electricity, all were hampering the efforts of the professional and voluntary operators in the floods. And that's what Elko said. We need more validation. We need more data, what happened and which infrastructure was offline for how long or not usable. There are gaps also in linking the topic of critical infrastructure with the overall topic of security. And I'm always like to show this nice chart from political scientists of the 1970s. And they said, actually on the right-hand side, security is a configuration. It's not only a lack of information that we try to create by analysis in science, it's also a lack of coordination of action, which is rather more in, say, the action field and the policy analysis maybe. But even that only makes the half of uncertainty of futures for security, because the other half is a conflict, a distribution conflict or ideological conflict that we're often not having to model it. We're not having it to combine the social, qualitative with the quantitative assessments. And I smuggled in the last one, linking the critical with blue, green, and gray infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? Last map, we see an area where we're working at the moment in a project called Co-Site. And you see that we have green areas, forests. We have blue areas, potential flooded areas in riverine scenarios. We have gray infrastructure, the settlement areas around the cities and the road network. And we have brown areas where there's brown coal mining that is phasing out due to the conversion to more renewables, and it'll be replaced by recreational areas and lakes in the future. So we do have an area that's combined of different types of infrastructure services. And while there's a lot of research about green infrastructure services or critical or blue, we hardly see them combined in assessments yet, is my assumption. So thanks for allowing me to present my ideas. I'm aware it's a bit, geographic and mapping centristic, but I try to collect a few ideas to kick off a discussion and hopefully stimulate to share also your research and what you think is still missing in this presentation and our ideas on critical infrastructure. Thank you. So thanks. I can take a few questions, and then if there are none, Elko will take over to moderate the collection of your ideas about the 20 unsolved problems. Thank you. Great, thanks. So Elko, I guess we can start with the collection of problems.
Yeah, sure. Oh, there's a question by Herbert.
I would like to make a remark because it was always already mentioned more times. You need more data. And from my experience, forget the data, you will not get them. And if you get them, they are not very accurate because the data owners often do not have good data and they are changing on the whole time. So if you make models based on real data, it will be very difficult to get right results because they have already changed when you have used them. And so it should be a more generic way to look to this topic because I think it will be much more successful.
I can only support this. Thank you, Herbert, because I realized that you will never get the data, and I rather try to work with bad data. So a lot of what you've seen is unrealistic or is hampered, by lacking exact data. But what I said is that I shown some of the bad maps to a provider, and they said, look, we cannot give it to you, but it doesn't look bad, So for general planning to raise awareness about the topic, we can go ahead without waiting. And you're right, much of the data that I've seen that is kind of, not accessible is also not much useful.
And the second topic, when I can add, we are speaking about complexity. And complexity means to find out the patterns and not so much the details. So it's much more important to find the patterns and show up them, and hopefully it will help the business owner to do something with it. But at the moment, it's very difficult because I know this also from my side of work.
I agree, but I must say that also it helps to show the first responders and those very detailed examples so they understand what they can do. So we need both complexity for planning and patterns, but also some concrete examples like you do it in practical, examples showing photos of what happened, etc. Yeah, Heather, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Alexander, for the overview. Something that I was just thinking about, so you mentioned in your maps, one thing that's not included are these other, sort of related hazards. So the erosion that happened at the pit. And so that's not in the mapping. And I would say my general impression is that this is a big challenge actually for flood hazard and risk mapping, is that geomorphic changes are very poorly considered, but actually this is quite critical for infrastructure impacts, because it's often when you have high levels of erosion that you get these longer term disruption and more damage to, railway embankments, bridge piers, and so on. And so I was just curious, maybe this then relates to maybe some of the challenges that we want to talk about in this meeting, but I'm wondering if you feel like you've seen progress on these kind of, and geomorphic erosion changes being better incorporated into infrastructure risk assessments, or if you maybe also see this as a big gap.
All right, thanks very much, Heather. Fully on your side. So first of all, I have to say they employed a geologist professor to make an assessment of the gravel pit and to make sure how many meters should be a buffer zone for safe housing there. So they made sure to make a proper assessment of it, and they still had difficulties with it. But I think your point is how to connect it to others, you know. And just yesterday, I've been on a presentation where actually the riverine flood scenarios are not connected to the heavy rain flood maps produced in Germany already. So I know people and everyone's working on their hazard. So there are geomorphologists having the expertise and are quite happy. We're having a big project. Also, Niels is in that one, where geomorphologists are trying to analyze that. And we were quite enthusiastic to make a paper about it, but we never found time yet. So if you'd be interested, please reach out and we can maybe make a small group. Yes, thank you. Joel.
Hi, Alexander. Thanks a lot for your presentation. That was very interesting. I think I didn't fully understood the gap 9 regarding the security frameworks. I was hoping you could maybe expand a bit on that.
Right. So what do you mean on the idea what we should do with it, or?
Yeah, just the concept, basically.
Yeah. Sorry, I was rushing through it literally, you know. So I think the idea is that we should better think how we are we working on epistemological gaps, you know, knowledge gaps? And if so, there are already concepts from political science where we could say, look, it's already been recognized. When we're frustrated, like Leonard is writing, our risk maps may be counterproductive in the chat, you know. I don't think so. I think knowledge is still important as it's raised in the Sendai framework, but it doesn't lead to any transformative or any other type of action when we don't consider there are shortcomings in, you know, conflicts, coordination, etc. So finding a way how to weigh that, you know, with social factors of decision making, of conflicts, etc., is a huge challenge. I don't know how to do it, but this framework always just stimulates me to do at least think about it. Was that what your question was, or do you have any follow-up?
No. That's interesting. That's not something that I really thought about. So yeah, and I'd be curious to look into that also. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to talk more about that. Yes, then Thilo.
Thank you. I'm not coming from the modeling area. I'm coming from the medical field. And something that I believe is people are aware of is heat waves and what that means. I'm not sure, and this is why I want to discuss it, whether the interconnections are clear, like linking old and young persons' homes with the nearest possible cooling area, with the nearest hospital, these kind of things. I think it's very complex, and it's from a climate change perspective. It's something that I'm working on as well. We are expecting this big heat waves, and we really do not, to my knowledge, know very well the consequences.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't present those examples, but I'm fully on your side that heat waves are under-researched, maybe in terms of climate change connected to critical infrastructure. And one way to address this is the connection to wildfires. You know, certain extreme events are very much pushed. But the question of gray infrastructure, a city layout, how to preserve fresh lanes, but also to create environments is one area to connect it. The other is we have colleagues in Paris who made evacuations of elderly citizens to better prepare because the heat wave in 2003 has killed so many people. And they found out that they need better strategies to think about how to use infrastructure also in there, because what they made as a mistake was they tried to collect them one by one, put them into a car without air conditioning, and they dehydrated sitting and waiting in the lorry instead of sitting at home. So yes, I do believe heat waves connecting to social infrastructure services such as health care systems, but also others, like, of course, the sagging power lines who can then trigger wildfires, is a bit maybe under-researched. Thank you. Evelyn.
Yeah, again, thanks a lot, Alexander. Super interesting presentation. You mentioned it in various aspects. I think the relationship between critical infrastructure functionalities and the way they provide services, and like how and who accesses these services, which is not the same thing, I guess. You mentioned the thing of like, if you have a big enough truck, you might still be able to drive over partially flooded road. Just because a hospital entrance is flooded doesn't mean it's necessarily dysfunctional, but then also certain populations might just never have been able to access certain services. So with this, yeah, this interlinkage between infrastructure functionality and how to access services, what's your thought on that? How can we better model these things? What's missing currently? Where to go in that direction?
It is a huge challenge, Evelyn. You know, I'm trying to promote the idea of social vulnerability for many years now, and it takes so long to pick up, you know, on different fields. And this is where we would need to connect this. So indeed, I fully support what you say. It would be very interesting to better analyze who's affected more by these service outages and also maybe by the transformations. So currently there's a great interest in climate change pathways and developments and transformations. And maybe that's a venue, not only to look at the hazards and impacts, but also what will change and which population groups will be more dependent, you know, on certain services. Especially I'm thinking about IT and internet, etc. So we'll have new social groups even very much dependent like we are at the moment on the internet. And in addition, we find differences because some young people going to school in different countries don't have that access. And we even saw this in Germany, you know, where people had different possibilities in participating in public education using that. So definitely, I think that's a big topic to come. Yeah, thanks, Elko.
Sorry, I'm just throwing it in here, considering the few minutes left.
Yeah, 3 minutes left of the official 1 hour. So,
but I think the last a lot of ideas have been posed already in this discussion. So I think it's good that we are recording this so we can already later on write everything down and use this. So thanks already for sharing all these very useful and good insights and thoughts. So we had a bit of an idea based, and what we also experience, of course, right now in this discussion, that many people have quite a few thoughts on this, and people have different perspectives working from different fields. So our idea is that it would be very nice, and as also has been done in different academic fields, is to really see if we can identify the 20-something unsolved problems in CI modeling, and really trying to take stock of the current challenges in risk modeling through a community effort. And we really want to invite you to join in on this endeavor, to see if we can sort of really narrow down or pin down what we believe is really the scope of research that we should head towards in the upcoming 10 years or so. And the few examples I show here of 2 papers that have been written have been very successful as well within their respective fields. So I think there's an opportunity to write something like this. So a little bit about the process before more people leave while still being interested. Well, the next part has been sort of done already, but some people might want to stay. But our idea is that for the next month or so, feel free to share any thoughts and ideas through email. And by initially, I think we will consider, if you share a thought on email and your ideas, then you will be taken along as one of the people to jointly write this paper. So after we have a first set of ideas, then Alexander and myself will try to, we know how time flies, we'll try over the summer to write a first draft, but please bear in mind this could take a bit longer depending on what happens in life. And create a bit of a work plan for everyone involved. Like, let's say we have 20 people who tend to want to join this effort, then we will probably make small working groups jointly combining the different topics people have shared with us. And then hopefully in the last part of this year, we can sort of finalize and write a first draft and really use this webinar now as a starting point, and hopefully organize 1 or 2 meetings or so to discuss progress and move this forward. So that's a little bit the idea that we had so far. So I'm curious if there's any interest in joining. I see that time is up as well. So I'm not sure if people have our email addresses, but maybe we want to share that in some way in the chat now, so you can also email us any of your thoughts and ideas, and But I still keep the floor open for now, if people have some time to already join in on your thoughts on this. Mariana?
Yeah, thanks for organizing this idea. I think it's great. I was just wondering, are you planning to do like some kind of ranking of like how? Because I assume there will be many different problems, and we cannot tackle all of them. How do you want to synthesize and select a few of this? Do you have a structured procedure for that, or we're going to do yourselves?
No, not yet. So I think it depends a little bit on the involvement of people, but I'm sure we will need to bundle similar concepts. So I think we will first make a first outline or try to sort of map what has been shared, including our own thoughts, and then we can sort of make specific sections within a first draft of the paper, and then people can contribute to the section that is related to their potential challenges or gaps that they have provided. So I think that's probably a first way to go. But we have not developed a structured process on this yet. Roman?
Yes. So my question, which is also part of the problem, I guess, is how do you want to make sure that 20 people talk the same language about 20 issues regarding critical infrastructure network modeling? I mean, you know, we tried to do something same with only 3 people, and we had big issues already in speaking the same language. So do you have an idea already how you want to do this? And second question is for the collecting the challenges, can we also use the research question that Alex posted on ResearchGate already, or what do you prefer?
Yes. No, so yeah, so maybe on your first point about this different perspectives, good point. I agree. I think that's also the nice challenge of this. So I would not disregard that immediately as then we just don't do it anymore. But I agree, it will be interesting to see how different people will have a different definition or perspective of something that's a challenge or something that's necessary. But maybe I think it's also nice that we may start this a little bit naive to just see where we are heading. And there is a gap in this. We know that there are quite a lot of challenges. We know that we really do want to go across disciplines because we see that that's necessary. But yeah, where we are heading, I mean, Alexander and myself just posed quite some ideas and challenges, but now I think it's really nice to see what within the larger community are indeed the challenges. And this might come with different visions and views, but that's also part of the fun, I think. Heather?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, maybe just on the point of framing. So on the one hand, we've been talking about challenges. In your slide, you also said identifying the 20-something unsolved problems. So I guess, because I think some things maybe, like there's a lot of challenges we could talk about, but they're maybe not completely unsolved. I think, yeah, the framing maybe changes a little bit. I mean, how I would think about it anyway. So I'm wondering, yeah, if you're really, yeah, maybe how you define an unsolved problem, if that's the idea.
No, good point. Agree. Probably it will aim towards challenges, which sounds nicer than unsolved problems. But Christine, you have a thought on this?
I don't know if I have any solution to the raised problems here, first of all, thank you for the nice presentations. I got a lot of ideas for just challenges we could put in there, both from information security, system science, public administration perspective. So one possible way for framing could be to have just difficult different perspective to move around these type of problems. And if you look at the policy analysis methods, there is a method that's called what's the problem presented to be, and this could be a way to discuss about the problems. Then we don't need to define the problem in a way beforehand. So anybody who want to contribute can define the problem somehow by itself. So it could be an idea. So här spontaneously. So yeah.
Yeah, if I may, I like your questioning in all this. So it is an experiment. And, you know, the people who did this in mathematics in 1900, Hilbert's problem, they needed a conference with a nice venue in Paris and all that. So no, joking aside, I think it's good to put up a methodology and to think what is on your mind. So the first thing in a needs assessment, it should be open-minded, you know? So if you came here and you said, well, actually my problem is that it's a very specific modeling topic that is missing for me. I think it's as valuable as if you come in and say, look, this part of non-natural hazards or whatever is totally missing. And then we can combine certain methods that had already been applied. And there actually, as Elko has shown in his presentation, papers out by the United Nations who already tried to combine all these fields and flesh out where are actually the gaps existing. But we maybe, as the ones working in the field, come up with additional ideas. So first, let's collect the problems, as we call them, and describe yourself what you think is unsolved. Is it public acceptance? Is it lack of data? And then we can start to categorize it maybe. And then maybe the idea from Christine is great. If you could share that methodology, if you'd be interested to join, we can have a look at it if that helps. But as Elko said, it's a bit of a let's try approach, experimental. And we were just curious how many people show up, and we're already very happy so many of you are still staying around and seem to be interested.
So maybe to make it most concrete for now, what I will do is I'll just, because I don't think we didn't put our email addresses somewhere, though, of course, it's easy to find. What I will suggest is anyone directly interested can maybe just send me an email for now. And perhaps what we will do is we'll create a sort of structured Google form type of thing where then people can add their challenges in there. So then we can nicely already collect a more structured overview. So that would be maybe a first good start. There are many in the room, but all of you have seen myself or Alexander. So I guess it's most easy if you just contact us. And then depending on how much excitement or response we get, we will move from there. Are there any remaining questions or things to discuss? Or I see now it's the time also for more people to leave, which I fully agree with. All right, Alexander, you want to close off as the host of the session?
No, I'll start and then you take over. Thanks very much, everyone. It was a joy having you during these busy days on a sunny day here in Bonn, Cologne, and have a very great day. And maybe let's reconnect. Every one of you who has an interest, just write to us and then we'll see what follows next. Thank you.
Yes, thanks and have a good day.
Bye-bye. Okay, Elko, I just sent you the notes I've taken, okay? And then we'll make, as you said, some structure and circulate it.
Yeah, that sounds good. No, this was, I'm so positively surprised by the amount of people that called in, almost 70.
Yeah.
So I think we can call this I think it was a successful RiskKAN webinar.
Absolutely. You draw the crowds with your EU projects.
For you, no, I think it was good. So thanks, and we'll see how many people will join in, and then we'll just follow up after we've received some response.
Exactly.
All right.
All the best, and hopefully you find some rest. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
For
Thanks. Talk soon again. Bye bye.